Well, we can speak now to Stuart Patrick. He's Chief Executive of the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce. Afternoon to you, Stuart. And the reality of these Tier 4 restrictions are brutal, aren't they, for businesses in Glasgow?
Well, indeed. Good afternoon. Yes, an awful lot of businesses, and particularly the smaller businesses, will be feeling despondent today, genuinely fatigued at being switched on and off like light bulbs all the way through this crisis. It puts about 80,000 jobs in the city itself into suspension, about 170,000 jobs across the city region as a whole. So at the time, it could hardly be worse. So close to Christmas, closed right into mid-December. That's going to really stretch a lot of small companies' cash reserves just when they need to build up those reserves to survive the rest of the winter.
Yeah, I was just going to say it couldn't come at a worse time, could it? And particularly for small businesses where cash flow can be very lumpy, that build-up to Christmas is crucial, and now they'll be losing weeks of it.
Yes, indeed. And a lot of discussion amongst the members about whether the level of support for businesses is sufficient. Obviously, a job retention scheme is there, and that's very welcome. Equally, there are small cash grants, but it's becoming more and more obvious that the cash support for closed businesses just isn't enough. It doesn't cover rent, it doesn't cover insurances, it doesn't cover employers' NIC or staff pensions or bank loan repayments. These all have to be paid for, and they will all have to be paid for next year at the times when trade is bound to be slower.
I suppose something that is instructive, though, is looking at, with the previous lockdown in the spring, when it was lifted, what did the resurgence of trade look like for businesses? Did it come back fully on flow, or was it sort of a slow trickle?
No, it definitely did not come fully back on flow. If you looked at the figures for Glasgow city centre, retail would maybe come back up to about just over 50% of what it was in a normal year. Hospitality was slightly below that, and really affected were hotels and accommodation. We're looking at hotels and accommodation that were showing occupancy rates down at 10 to 12%. In September, so before this discussion of this next lockdown began. So absolutely, the trade did not come back to the levels that it was before the pandemic.
I mean, I can only presume morale is very low in the business community. Is there anger as well?
Yeah, I think disillusionment is probably the right word. And I think the disillusionment comes especially amongst the smaller business community, that they had invested millions in preparing a safe business premises. They had put the money into the test and protect system. And I think the disillusionment comes because they're not convinced that the evidence truly demonstrates that a shop or a restaurant was a serious centre of transmission, nor were they convinced that the test and protect system was actually operating particularly well. Too many examples of companies who were operating test and protect and were never contacted throughout the entire time that they were operating it. So the feeling almost that an almost implicit deal that they would do that investment in making the premises safe, and then they would get an effective test and protect system from the government that would help to keep the case levels down, and that just hasn't worked.
And the disillusionment that you describe, I mean, who's that directed at? Is it directed at Scottish Government, or is it directed at Westminster?
I think it's shared between the two governments. I think there is a sense that, the Scottish Government has performed better in terms of communication of the issues, but I don't think that's shared by the business community, who've tended to feel that they've been pretty low down the priorities. And as a consequence feel that their asks about planning for reopening and acknowledgement of the work that's been done to make premises safe hasn't been fully accepted or acknowledged by the Scottish Government. But equally a concern that the level of financial support that's been put in by the UK Government just hasn't been sufficient to keep them alive during this particularly challenging time.
Glasgow is a real powerhouse, isn't it, of the Scottish economy. Some 28% of companies make their home in Glasgow. It's more than a third of jobs in Scotland are in Glasgow. How is Glasgow going to look after emerging from the second time of this, do you think? I mean, how many businesses and jobs just aren't going to make it through to the other side?
Well, we worry about the kinds of reports coming out, like the one this week from PwC that was showing that after the first lockdown, as many as 1 in 5 shops in city centres didn't reopen, and that before this wasn't, of course, during the Christmas season, which is so important to shops. Equally, I think in the hospitality industry, where there's a lot of small businesses that are operating that simply don't have the same access to cash as a larger business does, we were concerned by the report that came out from City UK, showing just how many small companies across the UK were overextended on their borrowing. I think they were saying something in the order of 780,000 small businesses didn't or hadn't got enough resources to support the borrowing they'd had to take on. So yeah, we're genuinely worried that there will be quite significant gaps in the city centre high street when this second lockdown finally comes to an end.
All right, tough times. Stuart Patrick, good to have you on Sky News. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Still to come.